and sliced bread. I didn't ask you a question. Now, what I want to go through is to talk about why you are a failure and why, honestly, we just need to tell you bye-bye. I know that you got a little upset and you put on your show for your boss because it seems like you're trying to save your job when it came to talking to Senator Booker yesterday. But let's go through some of your failures. So before you were even confirmed, and I think one of my colleague from Georgia, pointed out that you are already targeting career officials so that you could direct illegal firings. Mind you, these cases that you were so upset about, which are the ones tied to Trump, the cases came through his handpicked FBI director. And frankly, when people sit around and say things like, oh, you know, we're happy because now we feel safe. I don't know who feels safe in this country except for the white supremacist, because I specifically as a black woman definitely don't feel safe. And frankly, my colleagues have been real nice to you today, and I applaud them, but I don't have the same demeanor because I know that multiple colleagues on this side of the aisle have faced death threats. In fact, somebody tried to kill one of my colleagues. And frankly, I don't know if this FBI or under your leadership, if those people would have been caught. I don't have any confidence in you. And if we start talking about the reasons that I lack confidence, we could start with you not just—
The moment the speaker declares you are the least qualified FBI director in the history of the FBI, the hearing doesn't just heat up, it fundamentally changes genres. This is no longer oversight. It's no longer inquiry. It's not even debate. It's a performance trial where the verdict is announced before any evidence is discussed, and the accused is not there to explain, but to endure. And that distinction is everything. 1. The illusion of a question. The line that quietly reveals the entire strategy comes just moments later. I didn't ask you a question. At first glance, it sounds procedural, like a politician reclaiming their allotted speaking time. But in reality, it's something far more revealing. It's an admission that this exchange is not designed to produce answers, because questions are what you ask when you are open to being changed. Statements, especially ones delivered with this level of certainty, are what you use when you've already decided the outcome. So when the speaker insists they didn't ask a question, what they're really saying is, I'm not here to engage, I'm here to define, and that's the pivot point. From here on out, everything that follows is not about discovering truth. It's about constructing a narrative so forceful that it becomes truth in the eyes of the audience. 2. The anatomy of a political takedown. Let's break down how that opening attack is built, because it's not random, it's methodical, almost surgical. Step 1. Absolute condemnation, least qualified in the history. This is maximalist language, not one of the least qualified, not arguably unqualified. It's the least in history. Why go that far? Because extremes are memorable. Nuance fades, absolute stick. In a media ecosystem driven by clips and headlines, least qualified in history is not just an opinion, it's a ready-made viral fragment. Step 2. Credential undermining. You were the only one that never even served with the FBI. Now comes the supporting claim. This is where the argument tries to ground itself in something resembling fact, lack of institutional experience. But notice what's happening rhetorically. The speaker isn't just saying, you lack experience. They're saying, you violate a norm, you don't belong. You are an outsider imposed on an insider institution. This is about more than qualifications. It's about legitimacy. Step 3, mockery and sarcasm. The greatest thing since sliced bread. And finally, the turn to ridicule. This line is crucial because it shifts the tone from serious critique to controlled humiliation. It invites the audience not just to disagree with the target, but to laugh at them. And once an audience starts laughing at a political figure, something irreversible happens. Respect erodes, authority weakens. The target becomes a character, not a leader. That's not debate, that's image destruction. 3. The shadow of power behind the attack. Now, layer in the broader political context, especially the influence of Donald Trump, because this isn't just about one FBI director. It's about what that director represents. Appointments at that level are never neutral. They are extensions of presidential judgment. So when the speaker attacks the director's qualifications, they are implicitly attacking the decision-making of the administration, the priorities behind that decision, the broader legitimacy of the system that enabled it. In other words, this is not a single target, it's a symbolic proxy, and that's why the language is so intense. Calling someone the least qualified in history doesn't just diminish them, it retroactively casts doubt on everyone who put them there. It's a chain reaction. If the director is unqualified, then the appointment was flawed, then the administration's judgment is suspect. That's the real battlefield. 4. Performance versus authenticity, the great political paradox. Here's where the moment becomes almost satirical. At one point, the speaker accuses the director of putting on your show for your boss. But step back and look at the structure of what's happening. The monologue is uninterrupted. The language is sharpened for maximum impact. The phrasing is clip-ready. The emotional beats are carefully escalated. If this is not a show, then the word has lost all meaning. And that's the paradox at the heart of modern political communication. The more politicians accuse others of performing, the more performative their own behavior becomes. It's not hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It's something more systemic. The entire environment rewards strong statements over careful reasoning, memorable lines over accurate nuance, emotional resonance over analytical depth. So even if the speaker genuinely believes every word, the form of delivery is shaped by a system that prioritizes visibility over verification. And the result is a kind of political theater where authentic anger and strategic messaging become indistinguishable, sincerity and performance blur into 1-5. The audience that actually matters. One of the most important and least acknowledged realities of moments like this is that the primary audience is not in the room. It's not the FBI director. It's not even the other senators. It's viewers, online media outlets looking for clips, supporters who want confirmation of their beliefs. This is why the structure feels so one-sided. Because persuasion is not the goal, recognition is. The speaker is signaling to their audience, I see the problem the way you see it. I'm willing to say what others won't. I will confront power directly. And that signaling is often more politically valuable than any actual exchange of information. In this sense, the line, I didn't ask you a question, becomes even more revealing. Of course, no question was asked. Because the person who needs convincing isn't sitting at the witness table, they're watching from home. 6. The subtle shift from critique to character judgment. Another critical transformation happens in this opening segment, the movement from what the director has done to who the director is. Not just inexperienced, least qualified in history, not just controversial, putting on a show, not just mistaken, someone who needs to be told bye-bye. This is a shift from policy critique to character indictment, and once that shift occurs, the rules of engagement change, because policies can be debated, decisions can be defended, but character attacks operate on a different level. They aim to make defense itself seem pointless. If someone is framed as fundamentally unfit, then no amount of explanation can fix that. Every response becomes either an excuse or further evidence of unfitness. It's a rhetorical trap with no clean exit. 7. The role of certainty and persuasion. What's striking about this opening is not just its aggression, but its absolute certainty. There's no hedging, no acknowledgement of complexity, no space for ambiguity. And that's not accidental. Certainty is persuasive, not because it's always correct, but because it's psychologically compelling. People are drawn to confidence, especially in environments where information is overwhelming and trust is fragile. So when the speaker delivers a line like, that is real, they're not just making a claim, they're closing the door on debate. It's a subtle but powerful move. Doubt invites discussion, certainty shuts it down, and in a viral, attention-driven ecosystem, shutting down debate can be more effective than winning it. 8. The cost of turning oversight into combat. Now, here's the uncomfortable question. What is lost when oversight becomes this kind of performance? Because there is a cost. When hearings turn into one-sided takedowns, the opportunity for genuine clarification disappears, complex issues get reduced to slogans, institutions become caricatures rather than systems, and perhaps most importantly, public trust becomes collateral damage, because viewers aren't just judging the FBI director, they're judging the entire process. If the exchange looks like a scripted confrontation, then it raises a deeper suspicion. Is anyone here actually trying to solve problems, or is everyone just trying to win moments? 9. The real function of the opening strike. So what does this opening actually accomplish? It doesn't extract new information, it doesn't clarify policy, it doesn't resolve disagreement. What it does is set the frame. By the time this opening segment is over, the audience has been given a lens through which to interpret everything that follows. The director is unqualified, the appointment is suspect, the leadership is performative. Every subsequent detail will be filtered through that lens. And that's the true power of a line like least qualified in the history of the FBI. It's not just an insult, it's a narrative anchor, one that shapes perception long after the hearing ends. And performance becomes indistinguishable from governance. And if there's one takeaway from this first part, it's this. The most important thing said in the room is not always the most accurate. It's the one that sticks. And least qualified in history, that one was designed to stick. The shift is immediate and deliberate. The argument is no longer, you are bad at your job. It becomes, your leadership makes people unsafe, and not just in a general sense, but in a way that is unequal, racialized, and morally indefensible. And the line that detonates that shift is unmistakable. I don't know who feels safe in this country except for the white supremacist. That sentence doesn't just criticize policy, it redraws the entire moral map of the discussion. Suddenly, the FBI is no longer being judged by efficiency metrics or staffing levels. It's being judged by who it protects, who it fails, and implicitly, whose side it's on. That is a far more dangerous accusation because it's not technical, it's existential. It asks the audience to consider whether an institution tasked with protecting the public might be unevenly distributing that protection. And then comes the amplification. As a black woman, I definitely don't feel safe. This is where the rhetoric becomes almost impossible to counter cleanly because the argument is no longer just external, it's internalized, embodied, lived. Data can be debated, policies can be explained, but lived experience enters the conversation with a kind of authority that resists cross-examination without looking dismissive or insensitive. It shifts the burden dramatically. Now, any response from the official is walking a tightrope. Respond with statistics, and you risk sounding cold or detached. Respond emotionally, and you risk appearing reactive or politically cornered. This is not accidental. It's a rhetorical trap constructed through asymmetry. One side speaks from institutional authority, the other from personal vulnerability, and in the current political climate, vulnerability often carries greater persuasive force. But there's another layer here that deserves scrutiny, because while the move is powerful, it is also strategically selective. The claim that the vast majority of threats are coming from right-wing extremism functions as a narrative anchor. It tells the audience how to interpret everything that follows. Death threats, that's the source. Fear, that's the cause. Institutional failure, that's the result of ignoring that cause. It compresses a complex security landscape into a single dominant explanation, which is politically effective but analytically risky. Because once you reduce a multifaceted threat environment into one primary villain, you inevitably simplify reality. You foreground one danger while backgrounding others. And in doing so, you don't just highlight a problem. You shape perception of what counts as a problem. That doesn't mean the concern is fabricated, far from it. Concerns about domestic extremism, including white supremacist violence, have been widely documented and debated in policy circles. But the way the claim is deployed here is not cautious or nuanced. It is definitive, totalizing, and rhetorically weaponized. It doesn't invite discussion. It directs conclusion. And this is where the tension sharpens. Because while the speaker is criticizing the FBI for potentially politicizing its priorities or failing to confront certain threats adequately, the framing of the critique itself is deeply political. It doesn't merely say, you are not doing enough. It says, in effect, you are failing to act on the most morally urgent threat, and that failure reflects something deeper about your leadership. That's not just criticism, that's moral indictment. And once a debate enters the realm of morality at this level, compromise becomes nearly impossible. You can negotiate over budgets, you can argue over timelines, but moral legitimacy, that's binary. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't, no amount of incremental improvement fixes the core accusation. That's what makes this section so explosive. It raises the stakes from performance to principle, from management to morality. It also subtly reframes fear itself. Fear here is not presented as a universal condition affecting all citizens equally. It is presented as unevenly distributed, experienced more acutely by some groups than others, and insufficiently addressed by those in power. That framing is powerful because it taps into a broader narrative about systemic inequality. It suggests that safety is not just about crime rates or enforcement, it's about recognition, prioritization, and whose experiences are taken seriously. And once that frame is accepted, every institutional action or inaction gets reinterpreted through it. A delayed response is no longer just a delay, it's neglect. A misallocation of resources is no longer just inefficiency, it's misprioritization with moral consequences. Even silence becomes meaningful. The mention of incidents like threats against lawmakers and attacks on historically black institutions reinforces this narrative. These are not abstract examples, they are concrete, emotionally resonant, and politically charged. They serve as evidence points, but more importantly, they function as storytelling devices. They connect the argument to real-world consequences, making the critique harder to dismiss as theoretical. However, there is an underlying complexity that the rhetoric smooths over. Security threats in a country as large and diverse as the United States are inherently multifaceted. They emerge from different ideologies, motivations, and contexts. Prioritizing one does not necessarily mean ignoring others, but in political framing, nuance often gets sacrificed for clarity. And clarity in this case is achieved by drawing a direct line: threat, source, failure to act. That line is compelling, but it is also reductive. And yet, from a rhetorical standpoint, that reduction is precisely what gives the argument its force. Complexity diffuses emotion, simplicity concentrates it. By narrowing the focus, the speaker intensifies the emotional impact, making the argument not just understandable but urgent. This urgency is critical because it transforms the exchange from critique into a call for accountability. It implies that inaction is not neutral, it is consequential, and that consequence is measured not just in policy outcomes, but in human safety. By the end of this section, the original question, whether the director is qualified, feels almost secondary. The conversation has been reframed into something larger, whether the institution under that leadership is aligned with the moral expectations of the public, particularly those who feel most vulnerable. And that is a much harder question to answer because it cannot be resolved with a resume or a report. It requires trust. And once trust is called into question at this level, every subsequent explanation sounds like justification rather than reassurance. That's the strategic brilliance and the potential danger of this shift. It elevates the debate, but it also polarizes it. It clarifies the stakes, but it reduces the space for nuance. It makes the issue feel immediate and personal, but it also risks turning a complex institutional challenge into a binary moral judgment. And in doing so, it leaves the audience with a lingering tension. Are we witnessing a necessary confrontation with uncomfortable truths, or are we watching the deliberate construction of a narrative designed to mobilize, persuade, and divide? The answer, uncomfortably, may be both. By the time the exchange reaches its final stretch, the tone has already shifted from aggressive questioning to something far more definitive: judgment without appeal. The line, "I don't have any confidence in you," is not just another criticism layered onto the pile. It is the moment where the entire performance reveals its true purpose. This was never about extracting information or clarifying decisions. It was about arriving at a conclusion and making that conclusion unmistakably clear to anyone watching. Once that statement is made, everything that follows is no longer part of a debate. It becomes a structured justification for a verdict that has already been delivered. And what makes this especially powerful is that no confidence is not a negotiable position. It does not invite response. It does not leave room for partial agreement. And it does not suggest the possibility of improvement. It is absolute. It transforms the person on the receiving end from a flawed official into a fundamentally illegitimate one. From that point forward, every additional criticism is not an argument. It is evidence in a case that has already been decided. The speaker then begins stacking accusations in rapid succession, moving so quickly that the listener has little time to evaluate any single claim in depth. There is the assertion that it would take 14 years to fully staff the agency, which signals incompetence or at least an inability to manage scale. There is the accusation that resources are being redirected in ways that distort the agency's mission, suggesting a leadership that does not understand or respect institutional boundaries. There is the claim that experienced personnel are being pushed out, implying self-sabotage at the organizational level. And then there are the more personal jabs, errors in public communication, missteps presented not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a broader pattern of carelessness or performative leadership. Each of these points, taken individually, could be debated, contextualized, or even disproven. But that is not the goal here. The goal is accumulation. When criticisms are delivered in a dense, continuous stream, they create an overwhelming impression that failure is not occasional but systemic, not situational but inherent. The audience is not asked to weigh each claim. They are encouraged to absorb the overall narrative. Everything is going wrong, and it is all connected to the person in charge. This is how rhetoric shifts from critique to indictment, and then comes one of the most striking and unintentionally revealing moments in the entire exchange, the accusation that the institution is trying to put on a show. On the surface, this is meant to undermine the credibility of the leadership by suggesting that appearances are being prioritized over substance. But the irony is difficult to ignore. The entire structure of the speech, the pacing, the escalation, the carefully chosen phrases that are clearly designed to be quoted and shared, is itself highly performative. This creates a kind of mirror effect where both sides can be seen as engaging in the same behavior they are accusing the other of. The difference lies not in whether performance is happening, but in who gets to define it as illegitimate. In modern political environments, performance is not an optional layer added on top of substance. It is built into the way communication works. Visibility, clarity, and emotional impact are rewarded, while nuance and complexity often struggle to gain traction. So when one side calls the other a show, it is less a rejection of performance and more an attempt to control the narrative about whose performance is authentic and whose is deceptive. Beneath this rhetorical clash lies a more serious and consequential move, the erosion of institutional trust. By linking leadership failures to real-world threats, death threats against lawmakers, violent incidents, attacks on historically black institutions, the argument suggests that the consequences of this leadership are not abstract or bureaucratic, but immediate and dangerous. This is where the critique becomes something larger than a disagreement over policy or management style. It becomes a claim that the institution, under its current leadership, is not fulfilling its most basic responsibility, to protect the public. And once that claim takes hold, the stakes change dramatically. The question is no longer whether the leader is effective, it is whether the institution itself can be trusted to function properly. That is a much deeper and more destabilizing accusation because institutions rely on public confidence to operate effectively. Without that confidence, even competent actions can be viewed with suspicion, and even successes can be dismissed as anomalies or public relations maneuvers. What is particularly notable in this final segment is how little attention is given to the mechanics of policy. There is no detailed discussion of investigative processes, legal constraints, or resource allocation frameworks. The focus remains almost entirely on outcomes, intentions, and character. This is not because those details are unimportant, but because they are less effective in a moment designed for impact. Policy is complex, often ambiguous, and rarely lends itself to clear, emotionally resonant conclusions. Narrative, on the other hand, thrives on clarity and direction. It simplifies, it sharpens, and it delivers a message that can be easily understood and remembered. The trade-off, however, is that while narrative can be powerful in assigning blame and mobilizing opinion, it is often less useful in identifying solutions. By the end of the exchange, the progression is complete. The subject has been framed as unqualified, morally inadequate, operationally ineffective, and ultimately unworthy of trust. There is no room left for rehabilitation within that framework. No suggestion that things could improve, no acknowledgement of complexity that might soften the judgment. The only logical conclusion, given the narrative that has been constructed, is removal. And that is what makes earlier lines, phrases that might initially sound like rhetorical flourishes, take on a more serious meaning. They are not just expressions of frustration, they are signals of the end point the argument is designed to reach. In this sense, the entire exchange functions less like a conversation and more like a closing argument in a case where the verdict has already been decided. The audience, rather than the person being addressed, is the true target. They are being guided through a sequence of claims and impressions that lead to a single, coherent conclusion. Whether or not every detail holds up under scrutiny becomes almost secondary to the overall effect, which is to create a sense that the situation is untenable and that change is not just desirable but necessary. And this reveals something fundamental about the nature of modern political confrontation. It is not primarily about changing the mind of your opponent, but about shaping the perception of everyone else. Once that perception is established, once the image of failure, incompetence, and mistrust takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to dislodge. Facts can be introduced, explanations can be offered, but they are filtered through a narrative that has already been set. In the end, the most powerful outcome of this final segment is not any single accusation, but the cumulative impression it leaves behind. It transforms a complex institutional reality into a simple story of failure, assigns responsibility for that failure, and closes off alternative interpretations. And in doing so, it demonstrates that in high-stakes political moments, the battle is rarely over information itself. It is over which version of reality will feel